I didn't think they taught wine service in your neighborhood." That was the first thing he said to her. No greeting. No eye contact. Just those 12 words, sharp, cold, and dipped in centuries of entitlement. Imani Walker stood still, her hands steady despite the fire rising in her chest. Every server in the Crown and Ledger had warned her about Table 17. About the man who sat there every Thursday night at 7 sharp, like clockwork. Charles D. Kingsley. Billionaire. Payer, blinker. And to those who wore an apron instead of a suit, a nightmare in cufflinks. But Imani hadn't expected her first words from him to be a racial jab masked as snobbery. No one had told her it would feel like stepping into a courtroom, with her skin color already entered as Exhibit A. She looked him in the eye and placed the wine menu down as if she hadn't heard the insult at all. Her voice calm, precise. "Would you like to begin with a red, sir, or do you prefer to stay with Chardonnay?" The other servers froze, watching from a distance, pretending to polish silverware they'd already cleaned 3 times. It was happening. A new waitress, a black waitress, was refusing to shrink. What happened next would ripple through the marble halls of the Crown and Ledger for weeks. It would spark a fire across social media, ignite conversations in boardrooms, and eventually find its place in what some would come to call a black story. The kind of story no one expects until it slaps them across the face with grace, poise, and quiet resistance. And you, yes you listening right now, you'll want to stay until the very end. Because what started with a plate of scallops and a smug remark ended in a truth no one saw coming. This isn't just a tale of race and power. It's about what happens when the most unlikely person at the table refuses to be served anything less than respect. Keep watching. You need to hear this. The Crown and Ledger wasn't just a restaurant. It was an institution. Nestled in the heart of Manhattan's Upper East Side, it sat behind a polished black door with no sign, no neon, no gimmicks, just the quiet confidence of a place that didn't need to advertise. Those who knew, knew. And those who didn't, well, they weren't invited. Inside, the air was always a few degrees cooler than the summer heat or winter chill outside. The lighting was warm, deliberate, and flattering. Tables were spaced with surgical precision, wrapped in white linen that probably cost more than most people's rent. This wasn't the kind of place where you raised your voice. It was the kind of place where billion-dollar deals were signed with a subtle nod and the clink of a Bordeaux glass. The staff, impeccable, silent, invisible, by design. Each server moved like they were part of a ballet, synchronized, trained, and always watching. But there was one corner of this elegant sanctuary that disrupted the rhythm every single week. One table that didn't obey the rules of peace and discretion. Table 17. Tucked into the rear alcove near the floor-to-ceiling window, Table 17 had the best view in the house, a panoramic stretch of city skyline that sparkled just for him. But the view wasn't what made it infamous. It was who sat there. Charles D. Kingsley. Thursday nights belonged to him. Everyone in the kitchen, from the pastry chef to the dishwasher, knew the drill. The host turned pale when his name showed up on the reservation list. Managers started sweating through their designer dress shirts. And servers, if assigned to his table, would either fake illness or beg for reassignment. There were stories. A lot of them. Some whispered, some shouted, all unforgettable. Like the time a waiter recommended a Cabernet from Oregon, and Kingsley called it an insult to tradition, before requesting the sommelier be replaced on the spot. Or the new server who dared to call him sir, before the meal began and was later reassigned to cleaning wine bottles in the back storage for 3 weeks. Table 17 wasn't just a number. It was a symbol. A stage for performance. But not of the theatrical kind, as power. Of dominance. And everyone who approached it did so with the same quiet prayer. Please, not me. Not this time. Until Imani Walker showed up. Imani Walker wasn't supposed to be there. Not in that restaurant, not in that uniform, and definitely not in front of that man. But she was. And she stood tall, not because she was fearless, but because life had taught her she didn't have the luxury of folding. She grew up in Harlem, in a walk-up apartment with cracked walls and a view of the fire escape. Her mother worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, and still managed to tuck Imani in every night with a prayer whispered just loud enough to be heard over the sirens outside. Imani learned early that strength wasn't about volume. It was about survival. About doing what needed to be done, quietly, relentlessly. She got her first job at 16, bagging groceries after school, then bussing tables on weekends. Every dollar went toward something bigger. Tuition. Rent. Her brother Malik's asthma meds. She was the first in her family to go to college. Culinary school, on a full ride. Not because someone gave her a break, but because she earned it, beat out competition that never had to worry about rent, or dinner, or walking home after dark. When she graduated, job offers didn't flood in. Not for a young black woman with a resume full of grit, but no fancy connections. So she worked wherever she could. Pop-up kitchens, food trucks, catering gigs. Until finally, she got the call. The Crown and Ledger. It was supposed to be a stepping stone. A chance to earn enough tips to keep Malik in school and help her mom manage a new round of medical bills. She told herself she could do it. Smile, say, "Yes, sir," "No, ma'am," keep her head down. But Imani was never meant to blend in. She walked differently, spoke with clarity, carried herself with a kind of grace that made people pause mid-sentence. Customers noticed. So did management. And maybe that was why, barely 2 weeks into the job, she was picked to cover table 17. Maybe someone thought she wouldn't know better. Or maybe someone thought she could handle it. Either way, she wasn't afraid. She'd faced worse than rudeness in a designer suit. She didn't come to the Crown and Ledger to make waves. But when the tide came for her, she didn't run. Imani Walker stood her ground. Because that's what women like her do. The first real strike didn't come with raised voices or crude slurs. Charles D. Kingsley was far too refined for that. No, his weapon of choice was subtle humiliation, laced in old money, aged in arrogance, and served ice cold. When Imani approached table 17 for the first time, everything about her demeanor was textbook perfect. Her posture, her tone, the crisp precision of her uniform. She greeted him with the grace of someone who had studied not just service, but the art of human behavior. Kingsley, seated with his signature scotch in hand, didn't respond right away. He glanced at her once, then looked past her, as if she were a draft in the room, not a person. Then he spoke. "I had requested a familiar server." It wasn't a question. It was a dismissal. A signal that her presence was not only unexpected, but unwelcome. Imani, ever composed, replied gently, "Unfortunately, sir, your usual server is out today. I'll be taking care of you." Kingsley looked up again, slower this time. His pale blue eyes scanned her face, then her hands, then drifted downward in a way that was not overtly inappropriate, but unmistakably demeaning. "You people always say that, don't you? Taking care." He let the words hang in the air. Imani blinked once. That was all. No gasp. No stutter. But inside, she felt something shift. He continued, motioning to the wine list with a flick of his fingers. "Do you have any experience with French varietals? Or is your knowledge limited to local fare?" The implication was sharp, unmistakable. It wasn't about the wine. It was about who he thought she was. About where he thought she came from. Imani didn't flinch. She leaned in slightly, meeting his gaze. Not as a challenge, but as an anchor. "I'm certified in advanced wine service, sir," she said calmly. "And while I do have great respect for local fare, I assure you I'm fully capable of navigating the Bordeaux section." There was no sarcasm in her voice. No heat. Just truth. Delivered like a blade wrapped in silk. Kingsley said nothing for a moment. Then, with a dry chuckle, he murmured, "We'll see." But what he didn't realize was, he already had. Because in that moment, Imani Walker had already passed the first test. She just refused to recognize it as one. By the second visit, the game had changed. Charles D. Kingsley didn't raise his voice. He didn't lodge any formal complaints. Instead, he began to engineer moments, quiet, deliberate traps meant to break Imani without ever getting his hands dirty. It started with the water. He ordered it room temperature, no ice, served in a highball glass, not the usual stemmed glass. When Imani brought it exactly as requested, he frowned. "Did I say highball? I meant Collins." "Of course." No apology. Just a smug correction. Next, he asked for a steak. Rare, no seasoning, no butter, no garnish. She delivered it precisely that way, confirmed twice with the chef. He sent it back. "It's bleeding," he said, dabbing a napkin dramatically. "You do understand rare isn't the same as raw?" Imani didn't argue. She didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, replaced the plate, and requested a new one prepared, again, to his absurdly specific standards. He ordered a salad the next week, only to accuse her of choosing the wrong type of arugula. It had, apparently, too much bite. Every encounter was another landmine, buried beneath civility. There was no outright offense. Only the subtle performance of dissatisfaction. The way his eyes lingered on her skin when he spoke, the slight emphasis on words like qualified, or your kind of experience. Nothing you could write up. Nothing that would ever be reported. But Imani knew. And so did the staff. Backstage in the service alley, whispers spread fast. Some called it impressive, others pitied her. A few quietly hoped she'd snap, just once, so they could say it was her fault. But she didn't. Imani met every challenge with sharp precision and unshakable calm. She learned his patterns like a second language. She anticipated his reversals, memorized his quirks, and carried herself with a level of grace that made even Kingsley hesitate, if only for a second. Because no matter how many traps he set, she stepped over each one with the quiet, deliberate defiance of someone who'd been underestimated her entire life. This wasn't just about food or service. It was about something deeper. He was testing her presence. Nos. Her right to stand there. And every time she stayed silent and steady, she answered back louder than words ever could. The thing about men like Charles D. Kingsley is that their power often casts such a long shadow, no one dares to look behind it. But even the coldest tyrant doesn't emerge from nowhere. People whisper about his temper, his cruelty, his taste for control. But few know the story that built the man sitting at table 17 every Thursday night. It was Hector, the senior maitre d', who told Imani one night after closing. A man in his 60s, Hector had worked in restaurants longer than most servers had been alive. He'd served senators, CEOs, celebrities, and he knew every kind of difficult customer. But even he admitted Kingsley was different. "Back in the day," Hector said, wiping down the last table, "he used to come in smiling, with his wife. A daughter too. Beautiful little girl, curls like springs. She'd bring her teddy bear to the table." Imani listened quietly, her hands folded, still in uniform. They were regulars. Every Friday night, he'd order the same wine, tell the same story about how he built his first company from a warehouse in Jersey. He wasn't warm, not exactly, but human. Then one week, he came in alone. Hector paused. Didn't say a word. No wine. No story. Just silence. We figured maybe the wife left him. But the truth came out later. A car accident. A drunk driver, speeding through a red light on Fifth Avenue. His wife and daughter were killed instantly. The driver walked away. Wealthy. Well-connected. The kind of man who knew how to dodge accountability. He got community service and a suspended license. That was it. Kingsley tried to sue. Pushed for new legislation. But nothing stuck. The system had closed its eyes. He changed after that, Hector said, voice lower now. Stopped being a man. Became a storm in a suit. And ever since, he's been taking out his grief on the world. One plate, one server, one cold soup at a time. Imani felt the weight of it. It didn't excuse him. but it explained the cracks beneath the marble. This wasn't just about dominance. It was about control. Because once, when it mattered most, he'd had none. And ever since, Charles D. Kingsley had been trying to punish the universe for letting him feel powerless. It was a rainy Thursday when the host walked up to Imani with an envelope in hand, face pale like he'd seen a ghost. "He made a special reservation," Gregory said, barely above a whisper. "For tonight. Table 17. And he asked for you." Imani didn't flinch, but she felt it, a subtle tightening in her chest. This wasn't like the other weeks. It wasn't routine. Something about it was too quiet, too intentional. Gregory handed her the envelope. Inside was a typed card, formal and cold. "Miss Walker, tonight, I will require personal service. No substitutions. No interruptions. Charles D. Kingsley." There was no mistake. No buffer. It was a direct summons. And everyone in the restaurant knew it. The general manager offered to intervene. One of the other servers even volunteered to trade sections. But Imani declined. She'd made it this far. She wasn't going to start dodging shadows now. At exactly 7 p.m., 30 minutes earlier than usual, the Rolls-Royce pulled up to the curb. Kingsley entered alone, coat damp from the rain, eyes unreadable. He sat down at table 17 without a word. Imani approached with her usual calm, but this time, there was no script. No pattern. He didn't ask for the usual scotch. He didn't criticize the linen. Instead, he handed her a handwritten menu card, his own. "I expect every detail followed. No adjustments. No chef improvisations." She scanned the list. It was strange. An appetizer of blackened catfish bites. Collard greens, but without bacon. Cornbread served room temperature. And the main course, a gumbo, rich, spicy, thick, and dewy sausage. Acre. A family-style portion. It was soul food. Southern food. The kind of dishes rooted deep in Black history, Black struggle, Black resilience. Imani looked at the card again. And then she saw the final instruction. "Do not explain the dishes." That was the trap. He wasn't just asking for food. He was asking her to serve him her culture without voice, without story. To hand it over like it had no meaning. She met his eyes. They were waiting, measuring. Imani nodded slowly. "Very well, Mr. Kingsley," she said with even grace. "I'll begin preparations immediately." But what he didn't know was that this time, she had something to say. And no matter what the menu said, her story would be served with every single bite. Imani didn't storm. She didn't raise her voice or refuse the request. She did what she always did. She delivered. But this time, with intention sharpened to a fine point. She walked into the kitchen, handed the handwritten menu to Chef Mateo, and said one sentence. "I need these dishes made with full respect." The chef blinked. Then looked again at the list. He understood. He had grown up in Atlanta. He knew the roots of these dishes, knew they weren't just comfort food, they were history on a plate. Resistance seasoned with survival. Together, they prepared every element to perfection. But Imani did more than follow instructions. She infused meaning into every step. The catfish bites were plated on handcrafted ceramic, each piece unique, like the hands that had once fished those waters. The collard greens were slow-simmered, just as her grandmother taught her, rich in garlic and fire, bold and unapologetic. The cornbread? She refused to serve it plain. Instead, she garnished it with a drizzle of sorghum syrup and a sprig of thyme, subtle nods to Black Southern culinary heritage. The gumbo? It was the star. Thick, aromatic, layered in flavor. Every spice told a story. Of people who had made something extraordinary out of scraps. Who turned leftovers into legacy. When she brought the dishes out, one by one, Kingsley watched her closely. But she didn't explain anything. Not verbally. Instead, she placed each plate with care, eyes steady, her silence louder than any words. She let the food speak. And as he ate, slowly, curiously, something in him shifted. His brow furrowed, not in anger, but in thought. He looked at the plate, then at her, then back again. His grip on control wavered. Not because he was losing, but because he was realizing he'd never truly won. For the first time, he was being fed not just a meal, but a mirror. Each bite challenged him. Every flavor carried the history he'd tried to ignore. And in the quiet hum of the dining room, surrounded by chandeliers and pressed linen, Charles D. Kingsley sat still, chewing not just gumbo, but centuries of silence. Imani never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Because dignity, when served hot and steady, is impossible to swallow without tasting the truth. The meal ended without a word. Kingsley placed his silverware neatly on the plate, folded his napkin with care, and finished the last sip of his imported still water. Imani stood nearby, composed, present, but not intruding. No complaints. No compliments. Just silence thick enough to feel like a verdict. She approached the table with the check folder in hand, ready to begin the closing ritual. But he waved it off. "No need," he said, voice flat. "It's been handled." He stood, adjusted his cufflinks, and left without another glance. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Confused, Imani walked to the table and noticed the folder had already been left behind, tucked carefully under the bread plate. She picked it up, expecting a signature, maybe a zero-tip warning. Something cold. Something punishing. What she found instead made her stop breathing. Inside was a personal check. Handwritten. Crisp. Clean. $50,000. There was no note. No explanation. Just 2 words scribbled in Kingsley's tight, slanted handwriting on the memo line. For silence. The message was clear. He had heard her story, understood her subtext, and had responded the only way he knew how. Money. Power. Translated into quiet currency. It wasn't a gift. It was a transaction. Imani stared at the check like it was on fire. Her heart pounded, not with excitement, but fury. Beneath the tip amount, beneath the luxury, was the same old voice. Stay quiet. Take the money. Disappear. She walked straight to the manager's office, check in hand. The team inside had already heard whispers from the staff. They looked up in alarm when she entered. "I'm returning this," she said, placing the check on the desk like it was contaminated. "I serve food, not silence." The room went still. Even the general manager, a man known for strict neutrality, looked shaken. "You sure?" he asked softly. "Absolutely." She turned and walked out. It wasn't just a refusal of money. It was a declaration. She wasn't for sale. Not her story. Not her dignity. Not the heritage she had just honored with gumbo and greens. Imani didn't want his charity. She wanted his respect. And if he couldn't give it to her with his words, she sure as hell wasn't going to take it from his checkbook. Imani had no idea a storm was coming. She returned to her section, finished the shift, and went home like any other Thursday night. She didn't post about it. Didn't tell anyone outside the restaurant. As far as she was concerned, it was over. But the world had already begun to shift under her feet. What she didn't know was that a guest seated 3 tables away had recorded the entire exchange. The menu, the silence, the dishes, the check, and most importantly, her returning it. No edits. No commentary. Just raw footage of grace under pressure. The video was posted late that night on a small foodie account with the caption, "She just served him more than food. She served truth." Within hours, it went viral. By morning, #ImaniWalker was trending nationwide. Clips were being reshared by celebrities, activists, food critics, and civil rights organizations. The footage hit TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube like wildfire. People weren't just watching. They were reacting. Comment sections filled with outrage, admiration, tears. Some shared their own stories of racial microaggressions in high-end spaces. Others praised Imani for her composure, her quiet strength, her refusal to be bought. News outlets picked it up by noon. Crown and Ledger's PR inbox exploded. Phone lines rang off the hook. Journalists were calling non-stop, requesting interviews. Every major network wanted a statement. The restaurant issued a carefully worded press release, praising Imani's professionalism without directly condemning Kingsley's behavior. It was diplomatic, cautious. But the internet wasn't having it. Commentators demanded more. Why wasn't he banned? Why hadn't the restaurant supported her publicly? Why did it take a viral video for the truth to matter? Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere changed overnight. Staff members who used to whisper around Imani now sought her out, offered apologies, gratitude. Some of them admitted they'd stayed silent around Kingsley for years, and that her stand had given them permission to finally speak up. Even customers noticed. They asked for her by name, left generous tips. One couple brought her flowers. She hadn't tried to become a symbol. But symbols are rarely born on purpose. And while she remained grounded, Imani Walker knew something bigger than a meal had been served that night. A story had been told. And the whole world was watching. The fallout came fast and hard. Charles D. Kingsley, the untouchable titan, suddenly found himself at the center of a cultural reckoning. For decades, he had operated with immunity. But not anymore. The video of Imani returning his check was being dissected on national news. Late-night hosts weighed in. Think pieces filled headlines. Activist groups demanded answers, not just from Kingsley, but from every space that had enabled him. Old business deals came under scrutiny. Former employees, once silenced by fear or NDAs, began to speak out. Quietly at first. Then louder. Stories poured in from people of color who had faced similar dismissals, humiliations, and power plays. One board seat was dropped. Then, another. A speaking engagement at an Ivy League business school was quietly cancelled. Stockholders of Kingsley Industries began asking questions. He didn't issue a statement. He didn't show his face. For a man who had once commanded every room he entered, he now became a ghost in a world he once dominated. But while one story was closing, another was just beginning. Imani Walker was no longer just a server at a fine dining restaurant. She had become something else entirely, a voice. Universities reached out, inviting her to speak about dignity in service roles. Leadership conferences asked for her to headline. The TED organization offered her a main stage slot, the power of presence when you're not supposed to speak. And she took it. She stepped onto a stage in front of thousands, lights hot on her face, wearing the same quiet poise she carried at table 17. She didn't talk about revenge, or anger, or even racism in the loudest sense. She talked about silence. The kind that's expected from people who serve. From women. From black workers. From anyone who's ever been told their value is in being invisible. She shared how she had been tested, not by fire, but by subtle coldness. And how, by simply refusing to shrink, she had made space for something bigger than herself. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was thunderous. Because what Imani gave that night wasn't just a speech. It was a blueprint for standing your ground without ever raising your voice. And the world had never needed it more. Imani never asked to become a symbol. She was just trying to do her job, just trying to hold herself together while serving tables in a world that often pretended people like her didn't exist unless they were delivering something. But something happened when she didn't look away. When she didn't take the check. When she didn't play the part that had been written for her. The world noticed. And maybe that's the lesson. That real change doesn't always arrive with speeches or hashtags. Sometimes, it comes in a quiet moment, in a decision not to sit down, not to be polite when politeness means erasure. What Imani did that night at table 17 wasn't loud, but it was powerful. She reminded us that dignity isn't a gift handed down from the powerful. It's something you carry, even when the room tells you not to. She reminded us that silence, too, can speak volumes, if it's filled with purpose. And she reminded those watching from the sidelines, those who've been told to keep their head down, to say, "Yes, sir," to smile even when it hurts, that sometimes, just standing your ground is enough to shake the foundation of the room. Charles D. Kingsley faded from headlines, but the echo of what happened didn't. Imani went on to found an organization, Shift Service, dedicated to protecting and empowering people in hospitality, especially women and people of color. Not just with lawsuits and policies, but with mentorship, language, presence. Because the truth is, people like Imani have always existed. But for too long, their stories haven't been told. So let this be one of them. A black story not about suffering, but about standing. Not about being broken, but about breaking expectations. And if you're still listening, remember this. The next time someone tries to make you small, remind them you are not the help. You are the standard. You are the story. And it's time the world finally heard it.